reprise de débat, resuming debate. L'honorable député de...
The honourable member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Today is International Peace Day. Canada often promotes itself as a promoter of peace, and if we want peace, we have to prevent the proliferation of weapons and arms in troubled regions, in areas where human rights are not being respected, and where there are significant conflicts.
Record in this respect is rather troubling. Many Canadians would be troubled to learn that in the last 10 years, Canadian arms export have nearly doubled. More than that, Madam Speaker, Canada is the second most important arms exporter in the Middle East after the United States. So we are certainly very heavily involved there. Oui, Madame le Président, le Canada...
Madam Speaker, Canada is the second largest seller of arms to the Middle East after the United States. And we cannot call that region a calm and stable one. Now, in the past, our arms exports went to NATO countries. Today, more and more are going to countries where they have dubious human rights records. Saudi Arabia is the second largest buyer of arms exports from Canada. From a government that calls itself feminist, well, I find that very troubling, and I'm not alone, because we know that Canadians don't want that either.
Have good measures in place to control our arms export. We have strong regulations already. Yet, here again, look at Saudi Arabia. The regulations say that we should not export arms to a country if there's reasonable doubt, reasonable risk that these arms will be used to commit human rights abuses. And we have ample evidence that this is currently the case, but the government is simply blind to that. Oh, seemingly there's an investigation, but the Saudis themselves admitted that, yes, they wanted to repress people, and, well, not only blind, but seemingly the government is deaf on top of blind. And in August, we learned that Canada watered down its own criteria for arms exports to countries with human rights, bad human rights records. And the government did this after pledging that, that Canada would accede to the ATT, after saying that as of then, you know, Canada would respect both the spirit and the letter of the treaty, and typically liberal, they say that, and they do quite the opposite by watering down our criteria.
Now, the best figure to illustrate what I'm saying is perhaps, well, we know that we're exporting more and more to countries where human rights are violated. Are many of those permits being rejected? Well, Actualité did an investigation, and I will give you some information. Of 7,010 applications for export permits, how many do you think were denied? 10. On more than 7,000 applications. That says a lot. The main destinations include Saudi Arabia. I've already talked about that. Others include Algeria. So it's for these reasons that when the government finally decided to accede to the ATT, there was hope. It's something that we have been calling for years. We know that the Conservatives, for reasons that are incomprehensible, had always refused to sign on to these treaties. But in the NDP, we said to ourselves, finally, the government is going to take action, and we are going to join the ATT. Unfortunately now, and again typically, we've got a bill before us for the implementation of the treaty. Now, I know many people were happy to see it come forth, but once again, we can see this very liberal tradition of rhetoric and no action. Because this bill, Madam Speaker, is an empty shell.
Does not address at all the issue of our export to the U.S. And that is half of our exports. So all these exports will continue to fall outside the scope, of this law, and will fall outside the scope of the treaty. This in itself, to start with, is a breach of Articles 1, 2, and 5 of the Arms Trade Treaty. So one of the first things we're doing is we're breaching 3 of the key articles of the treaty. And it does matter beyond breaching the articles of the treaty. I mean, it's a matter, first there's a matter of transparency. When we get those annual reports on arms exports, and I hope that we will get them sooner and that we will get clearer reports that are transparent and understandable, well, half of our exports remain unreported. Is that transparent? I don't think I'm listening to my colleagues here, and I don't think they think it's the... And also, when we talk about meeting the letter and the spirit of the ATT, well, it means that arms can be exported from Canada, or parts of armaments can be exported from Canada to the U.S. and then exported elsewhere. The President Obama had put a ban on exporting arms from the U.S. to Nigeria because of human rights concerns. Well, President Trump has made a deal, the art of the deal, with Nigerian authorities and has lifted this ban. And now they are exporting planes and armament to Nigeria, made out components coming from which country, you think? Canada. So I think it would be important to cover our exports to Canada. Le gouvernement va peut-être...
Now, maybe the government's perhaps going to say, well, we export a great deal to the United States, but they'll probably say, well, because we export so much to the United States, it's over half of our exports, it's too difficult to change things or to do that. But there are other countries, Australia, UK, they do it. The UK is a NATO partner. They have systems in place to report and monitor exports to the US. And they can't tell us that they're going to respect or comply with the letter and spirit of the treaty and then breach specific articles of the treaty and not respect the spirit and letter. We'll say, oh, because that part's too difficult. It's one or the other. They need to comply with it or not. And clearly the government doesn't intend to comply with it. Moreover, and this is another major issue, the Act doesn't address the assessment criteria for export permits. And that is quite strange given the nature of this Act.
The actual concrete criteria, in fact, as one expert was telling me, you know, he was looking at the law and at the bill, sorry, and he was saying, but where's the meat, you know? Well, the meat will be in regulations. The concrete criteria to oversee arms export will be put in those regulations. Regulations that do not have to come to this House, that will not be discussed among representatives of Canadians from across the country. Regulations that can be changed at any time by this government or any subsequent government. This is so weak C'est de la poudre aux yeux, Madame la Présidente.
It is a smokescreen, Madam Speaker. And in addition, the background documents provided by GAC Canada, Global Affairs, the regulations will outline criteria that will be taken into account by the minister in issuing export permits. Now, we can already see this. There are already criteria that must be taken into account to assess export permits, and that gives us situations like the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. The ATT doesn't identify the criteria that must be taken into account. Out of obligation, serious, there must be serious limits. It must say one thing, this is prohibited, this is not, etc. Now, in the departmental documents, it says the minister needs to take these things into account. There aren't prohibitions. And so these regulations will be drafted subsequently behind closed doors. And that's where all the details will be included. Now, there's another problem. I have a very long list of problems. I won't get through them all. But based on the information provided by in the briefing document from Global Affairs, the Minister of Defense will have his own system for the implementation of this act. So that leads to confusion. The left hand will do one thing, the right hand something different. How will this all unfold? Are there any risks, Madam Speaker, that something will fall through the cracks? How will the harmonization occur? To my mind, there is simply no plan to deal with this.
Is basically telling Canadians, and not only Canadians, but telling the world is just trust us. But in matters of disarmament, I'm sorry to say, Madam Speaker, but I don't think this government can be trusted. We've tried, us, the NDP, to have, for example, to enhance transparency and oversight. We tried to have a committee that would, on an ongoing basis, study this issue of arms export, which Canadians care about. And what did the Liberals say? Well, no surprise, they said no. On nuclear disarmament, okay, when we asked the government to show the same kind of courage Canada has shown with regard to landmines and participate in the efforts of over 120 countries in the UN to work on nuclear disarmament, the government says, well, maybe it won't work, it's too difficult, we do this thing, as like if they couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. And on Saudi Arabia, I've already mentioned it, but let's come back. So we're selling arms to a country that abuse human rights despite our feminist foreign policy. The minister first told us that, we couldn't do anything, which I happen not to agree with, because a minister can suspend an export permit, because it was a done deal. And then we learned that he signed the export permits after he and the Prime Minister had told us that it was a done deal. And as I said, that Canada should not export arms to a country unless there is no reasonable risk that these arms will be used against civilians or to commit war crimes, for example. And so this government is not even respecting that norm. So what can we trust about the regulations they will put in someday once the bill passes? And what can we trust about how they're even going to respect those regulations? Another example, I have to say it still with respect to Saudi Arabia. When I asked the government yesterday about the arm deal to Saudi Arabia, I was basically told that, that the government had asked Saudi Arabia to respect human rights. And, I'm very pleased that the government did that. I'm somewhat skeptical about the efficiency of the maneuver. Alors, j'espère.
So, despite everything, we will approve this bill because it's something we've been calling for a long time. But we're only supporting it because we want to see Canada accede properly to the Arms Trade Treaty. And we really want to see that treaty respected. I hope that the government will show good faith and will agree to amendments in committee. So this is why we're supporting the bill. But this so-called implementation bill, because it's not really effective in implementation, we hope that it will be improved. The world would ask for no less. Now, at the beginning of my presentation, I was talking about World Peace Day and talking about the illicit transfer of weapons being an important source of suffering in the world because it leads to violence of all forms. With the Arms Trade Treaty, we will put an end to this. We want to put an end to situations where companies, Canadian companies based in other countries, can sell arms to South Sudan, for example. We want to put an end to situations where Canada is officially denouncing the tragedy in Yemen, where there's a huge humanitarian crisis, but at the same time is selling arms to Saudi Arabia, which is leading the coalition, which is now accused of war crimes in that region. We need to have a consistent arms export system, and unfortunately, this bill doesn't accomplish that. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you. I followed the comments very closely, and in particular those that reference Saudi Arabia from the colleague opposite. And I remember during the election campaign, the leader of the third party making a solemn promise at the gates of the very factory where these vehicles are being manufactured, to the union that represented the workers, to the leadership of the workers specifically, that come hell or high water, the NDP would honour the contract with this factory, between this factory and Saudi Arabia. The member from London Fanshawe made the same promise, the same commitment in writing to the workers, to the leadership of the union and to the corporation. They publicly held a press conference to declare that they would not, under any circumstance, there was no qualification, withdraw this trade deal between Saudi Arabia and the plant in the members' riding, London Fanshawe. I'm curious as to how they described that promise, why they made that promise, how they were going to fulfill that promise in light of the information which she has just shared with us, which predates that promise being made. Why did the NDP campaign so fervently, so deliberately, so specifically on honouring this contract, and then come into this House after the election and say we're just kidding?
The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And with all due respect, and I do respect my colleague, I feel that he's exaggerating a little bit when it comes to the language that was used. I wonder, now, something I want to mention is that what is produced in London, so the arms that are produced in London and the equipment there and the workers there, could also produce equipment for the Canadian Army, which really needs equipment. And it's a priority for us to take care of those workers and to ensure that they have a decent future. I'm also wondering if my colleagues saw this summer that there were all sorts of dissidents executed in Saudi Arabia, and there were serious allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity there. And there were weapons that were similar to Canadian LAVs used in Yemen and in the entire region. So those are news. That's news from recent months, and I'd be happy to share that with my colleague. Thank you.
Comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I do appreciate listening to what the member had to say today, as well as the others that have spoken to this issue in the House. As a new member of Parliament, the ATT is something new to me. There's a lot of information to process here, and I'm hearing conflicting perspectives on the Canadian Trades Control Bureau and its effectiveness. And of course, we all want, I believe, similar things. It's a matter of how we come about getting them. And so you have a lot of sorry, Madam Speaker. She has a great deal of experience, it seems to me, on this file. And I have a question in relation to the UN and the expectations that we have in this House on accountability and transparency and measuring outcomes. I'm just wondering if she's aware, for those that have already ratified this treaty, is she aware of what the current assessment is by the UN of the effectiveness of it to date in controlling and limiting illegal arms sales? Are they able to measure and determine if this is being effective or not?
L'honorable député de...
The honourable member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie.
I thank my colleague for her question. C'est une question très...
It's a very important question indeed. We need to follow up here. And I think there are two levels that we need to look at. We need to collectively have follow-up. I believe that the UN has an office that takes care of that type of issue. But that needs to be done collectively under the umbrella of the UN. And it's important that that also be done nationally within each country. Now, I'm very concerned that in Canada's case, half of arms exports will not be covered, and there will be no report done on them. There will be no evaluation, no monitoring, no follow-up. And I think that would be important. And that brings me back to the question of what we can do. The UN has a whole section that deals with disarmament and so on, and they follow up on those files. And I think that in Canada, it would have been a good idea to have our own monitoring and follow-up, our own committee that would meet regularly to follow that very important issue. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Skeena-Baltic Valley.
Madam Speaker, and I'm wondering if on one very particular point that since taking power here in Canada, we've had a transition in the United States with respect to their administration, and now we have President Trump, that there's one aspect of this ATT that I think should concern all of us, and certainly my Liberal colleagues, and particularly those that have said they stand up for human rights and want to bring Canada's reputation up in the world, that the exclusion of armaments to the United States from Canada, it's almost like a money laundering scheme, but an ethics or conscience laundering scheme in which armaments can be produced in Canada, exported to the U.S., made part of some armaments exports deal to countries that are known human rights abusers. She raised the case, I think, earlier of Nigeria, where Canada raises concerns about Nigeria's human rights record. And Canada could say, we will not directly export arms to Nigeria, but in fact, through the current bill as it's proposed right now, we can manufacture those same armaments in Canada, send it to the United States, where President Trump has said he has no problem with Nigeria's human rights record, make the weapons there, send them on to Nigeria, where they're then used to suppress human rights activists, to suppress minority groups within that country, as one example. I think there are other examples that we could call forward, where we would then condemn the Americans and say, that's not right, that they're sending those weapons to that country and killing people and human rights activists. The Prime Minister is at the United Nations today making a declaration. And in fact, I think in some ways counterposing himself to what President Trump had to say earlier to the world. His bellicose statements about encouraging more war and more conflict and less peace. I encourage the Prime Minister to make those statements, and I'm sure he will. Yet, is it not some level of hypocrisy to then put forward an arms trade treaty here in Parliament that essentially attempts to wash Canada's hands of any involvement, of any weapons sales to countries that we publicly condemn yet privately allow weapons to be continued to export while our manufacturing is contributing to that very involvement in human rights abuse. I'm not sure how the Liberal government can countenance this level of hypocrisy or just make the change. Say, we will not exclude the United States. I'm sure my colleague from Toronto would raise concerns with this from his constituents. I'm sure my colleague from Winnipeg, who will speak on this later, would also raise concern with his constituents to say that we will not sell weapons to this country. We can't do indirectly what we're not willing to do directly. If we're not willing to sell weapons to Nigeria for human rights concerns, then how, for heaven's sakes, would we sell them to the United States, who are willing to do the exact same thing in a more direct fashion? Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank my colleague for his question. And if I can steal an expression from him.
Reuse the expression conscience laundering, like money laundering. Yes, it's a big problem. It's a big issue. And it raises another point that I've mentioned in my speech, the point about regulations. And the fact that regulations can be changed by any government at any time. Because, yes, indeed, something happened in the United States. We now have the Trump administration, and in Canada, hopefully we will not get the same level of surprises, but, you know, administration can change, and we may, hopefully not, at some point get a government who's even more inclined and not fulfilling our commitments to the Arms Trade Treaty and further weaken the regulation. So these things have to be put into law. And that's one of the things we will be asking when going to committee. Thank you very much, Madam President.